Okay, in order to tell you about nuclear physics, I want to start out by reviewing a little bit about the structure of an atom. Now, this is probably something you've heard in middle school science class, but I want to go over it again anyway, just to make sure we're on the same page. Now, most matter in the universe, and all the matter that is familiar in our everyday lives all around us, is made of atoms. Atoms are all composed of three different particles, and let me start out by making a little diagram of an atom. Now, if you were to zoom in on a piece of solid material, like this whiteboard for example, with a high enough power microscope, it turns out that you would be able to see, and this has actually been seen, you would be able to see kind of fuzzy blobs that are arranged in regular patterns, sometimes not very regular patterns. And each one of these fuzzy blobs, if you go to the very highest resolution microscope, is an atom. Now, how big is an atom? Well, it turns out that from one side to the other of an atom is just about 10 to the minus 10 meters across. So that's extremely small. Turns out if I took a normal sized object, like for example an apple, let's suppose, and I sliced it, and I sliced it again, and I sliced it again. If I sliced an apple in half 90 times, I would have cut it into individual atoms. And I could not slice it any smaller than that. So this is the smallest kind of object that you can ever see in a microscope. It's called an atom. Now, it turns out that those are not the smallest objects that there are in the universe. In fact, if you were able to see inside an atom with an even higher resolution microscope, so if we were to take this circle here and zoom in on it, we would actually see that it's made up of even smaller particles. And those particles are arranged in two basic parts. One part is sort of a cloud, and most of that fuzzy blob I was showing there, I'm going to color it yellow here. Most of that fuzzy blob there is a kind of cloud, and this is what we call an electron cloud. The electron cloud is just composed of electrons. You can think of it as like a bunch of electrons that are wandering around, and they're all kind of whizzing around in various different directions. They're all clustered around here. They don't go flying off completely on their own, though. Now, electrons, you probably heard that electrons are negatively charged. So electrons have a charge of -1. So each one of these things here is an electron. And the electrons are all whizzing around, and most of the space of an atom is taken up by this electron cloud, which is just a bunch of electrons whizzing around in different directions. Okay, now it turns out that it took a long time to find this, but it turns out that at the very center, if you were able to zoom in 10,000 times more than this, you would find that there is a little tiny object in the middle. That little tiny object is much, much smaller than the atom. So remember again, the whole atom here, the whole electron cloud, is 10 to the minus 10 meters across, approximately. Some atoms are a little bigger, some are a little smaller, but they're all pretty close to that. If we were to zoom in the center of this thing, we would find that this thing is actually itself composed of many different other particles. Now, the name of this thing which is sitting at the center you've probably heard of. The name of this thing in the center is called the nucleus. And it turns out that almost all of the mass of the atom is right sitting there in the middle, in the nucleus. All this electron cloud that takes up most of the space has very little mass. So the nucleus has almost all the mass. It's concentrated in that one little dot. It's a little bit like the solar system, where you have the sun in the center, which has almost all the mass, and then you have a few planets orbiting around which have much, much less mass and take up a lot of space. Okay, so let's zoom in on the nucleus there. So we'll just zoom in one more time and see what we might see. I'm going to make these electrons go away. And let's see what we get. If we zoom in far enough into the nucleus, we find that it itself is composed of a bunch of different kinds of particles. So I'm going to represent them with M&Ms. So let's suppose we were to zoom in on the nucleus here. Here's a nucleus of an atom. How big is this thing? This thing is actually only about 10 to the minus 15 meters across. So this is 100,000 times smaller than the electron cloud. Now, what are these things in the center here? What are these things in the middle of the nucleus? Well, the nucleus is composed of the blue particles, and those are called neutrons. Neutrons have a charge